Now in our last video we saw that we got a bit of an interesting graphics card with it. I mean, besides the point the PC was 10 years newer than the graphics card in it, it was at least a weird and quirky MSI branded graphics card where the heatsink actually is the shape of the MSI logo, something you really just don't see anymore. But the question is, why did MSI start making these? Were they any good? And just what is the history behind MSI even deciding to make this thing? Because it released on a few graphics cards, I think I've managed to track down the full list, and where did they originally decide that this was a good idea? So join me today as we're going to find out why on earth they decided to make this. Now, trying to track down history of not just a graphics card, but a graphics card cooler, turns out is unbelievably frustrating with very little in the way of resources or any real documentation. I mean, we know these things are popular because anytime they get popped up online, you'll find them posted on somewhere like Twitter or Reddit or somewhere like that with a ton of likes or upvotes because it's a quirky and weird thing. But I've done the best job I can to try and track down where this cooler actually came from. And it turns out there are multiple graphics cards with multiple versions of them using multiple different versions of this type of cooler. The launch of the MSI design seems to have started with the GeForce 4 MX4000 series by the start of 2004, at least according to some MSI website documents I found and a combination of the Wayback Machine. But it does seem like some examples of this design of cooler actually made their way to the market in the end of 2003. And I mean, that's what the manual says, and it's not that it specifies any real photos of the card, but using the Wayback Machine, I did find evidence of this cooler being available on sale by December of 2003, at least in the UK. It made its way into the mainstream though later that year, well, not later that year, but later the following year, becoming the de facto cheap MSI cooler. And I'm assuming they made it for no other reason than it looks quite cool. It made its way to the FX 5200 on Nvidia's low-end side, and ATI's Radeon 9250. They're both cards of questionable quality, but the Nvidia side, MSI only sold these with the really low-quality FX 5200 cards. So it lingered on for a little while there. And then it managed to linger on even longer, with some examples coming out for the next generation. There's a few of them around and they tend to be a little bit rarer, nothing too difficult to find, on some weird Nvidia GeForce 6200 models. And weirdly enough, it actually won some awards here. That's the only information that exists about these, is that they managed to win awards with this cooler. And then finally, it made its way to low-end ATI in the year of 2005, bringing us to where we are today with this strange ATI Radeon X300, with that fun-looking cooler slapped on top. Now, there may be some more obscure models out there, but it does look like MSI dropped the design in late 2005 and early 2006, because as cool as it looks, it cools terribly, and it probably also made a dent in their profit margins, given there was beginning to be very little profit to be made in this region of cards. But in our case, what exactly is the Radeon X300? Well, the X300 came out in three versions, the rather competent X300 and X300 Pro, which make up the rather decent versions of the card, and then you have the cut-down versions, which is the LE and the SE. The SE serving as the most cut-down version, and the version of the card that MSI decided to stick this cooler on. It was mostly designed for entry-level users, and most people that found one in an OEM system, think Dell, HP and the likes. Things like that. You know, it's a card you just find whacked in a computer to act as a display adapter. It features a GPU core based on the RV370, which is at least the same as the standard X300, and features a GPU core that comes clocked in at around 325 MHz. It can vary by manufacturer, but generally it's around this mark. Memory-wise, it comes with 128 MB of DDR memory, and here comes the biggest problem. This is of course squeezed through a 64-bit memory bus, which is usually a 128-bit memory bus on the higher end models, and the performance difference, Well, it can make up quite a lot, but they were still rather competent cards back in the day. It's also one of the early PCI Express cards from this era, which makes this almost interesting, because it means that you have a PCI Express low-end card that supports at maximum DirectX 9 and Shader Model 2.0. Nothing fancy at all there really, but it was a display adapter that was actually okay to use, and I have fond memories of using because I used the mobility chip that was very similar to the cut-down SE variant here in a laptop for a long time, so I know what they are capable of, and I used one for quite a while. As for the world of drivers, well, they do work on Windows 11, which is what we're testing on here today, and they are the final ones for Windows Vista, but they tend to work on any operating system from Windows Vista upwards, and they're dated around sort of 2010 time. Unlike Terrascale, AMD did actually bother to give the X series some rather competent final drivers, something I've investigated before, and they're a graphics series where you can install the latest ones and you don't really have to worry about it hindering performance or any compatibility problems. Isn't that lovely? I did do some testing against the original operating system they were designed for, which is Windows Vista, and we'll get into that later on in the video, but there's very little reason to actually worry about me testing on Windows 11 here. It does work surprisingly well in Windows 11, albeit the driver you have to install manually because it doesn't want to install normally, which does make sense because the operating system it was designed for is, what, 15-20 years older than this? But anyway, we've got the card installed, we've learnt what cooler it has on it, we've learnt what card we've got. All that's left to do is find out how can the very last MSI cooler graphics card, heatsink, whatever you want to call this thing, perform in the benchmarks. Starting off the benchmarks, we have GTA San Andreas. And I probably was being a little bit optimistic with the resolution of 1024x768, but we are at least able to use medium settings. With a lower resolution, which would probably be the best option, you'd probably see well over 30 FPS. Generally though, you could see around this in lighter situations, but as a start, medium settings in 1024x768 for a very Xbox/PS2 experience is not the end of the world for a low-end display adapter. Maybe I was expecting a little bit too much here, but the game did at least look alright. On a little bit more of an optimistic note, Banished was able to run with low settings in 800x600, and given this is quite a lot newer than the card, this was far better than I was expecting. In fact, last time I ran Banished on an X300 style card, we were seeing around half the frame rate we're seeing here, so maybe this game's had a few updates across the years that have resulted in a slightly better experience. Either way, 40 FPS on average with 1% lows down to 31 FPS in Banished is well more than playable, and the low resolution doesn't necessarily mean the game looks bad. If you're looking at this and thinking that's a very strange resolution, 854x480, well, it turns out that is actually a properly scaled 16:9 resolution that ends in 480p, so it actually looks really rather nice, and is something that only seems to have ever become accessible for me on this weird X series of cards. So we had Counter-Strike Source running with low and medium settings, seeing around 72 FPS on average and 1% lows down to 59 FPS. It's more than enough to be considered playable, but doesn't make up for the fact that I am fairly awful at Counter-Strike Source. At this point I am just going to refer to that resolution as 480p because it more or less is. It just happens to scale rather nicely onto modern widescreen displays. But don't starve here, running in 480p with the default settings enabled saw a pretty much locked 30 FPS. This shouldn't really come as much of a surprise, as I used to play this on an old laptop with a Mobility Radeon X300, and is one of the reasons why I decided to benchmark it to make sure it could still run after this many years. So Don't Starve isn't really a problem, and given the Don't Starve Together version of this also runs completely fine, it means that we are still seeing games that are in the top 100 on Steam now still running on a 2004 display adapter. Fable: The Lost Chapters pretty much went to show that you can expect very similar to the original Xbox levels of performance, even with very similar settings and a slightly higher resolution. So in 480p with medium settings we would see around 36 FPS on average, with 1% lows down to around 26 FPS. One of the main hindrances here though was particle effects. I'd imagine that'd have something to do with this being a cut down version of the card, and it really can struggle with them in places. Notably, flames caused a lot of problems, which is when you'd see the game drop to the mid-20s, or when there were lots of NPCs on screen. But still, Fable the Lost Chapters, still rather playable on an X300. Now, Game Dev Tycoon is another one that I used to play on my ancient Mobility Radeon X300 based laptop, and here we did have to drop things back to 720p and we used performance mode, as it would appear that after a few years and a few updates along the way, Game Dev Tycoon has for some reason become more intensive. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's still more than playable with 39 FPS on average. It's just funny that a 2D game like this can actually become more intensive than it used to be. But it's still playable, you're just going to notice a little bit of delay in places. Now, I've never been very good at Operation Flashpoint, and the settings menu for this game is remarkably confusing. Genuinely, go into it and try and understand it. You can pretty much tweak this game down to whatever settings you want, from texture size, to shadow size, to effect size, all of these different resolutions. So I thought, you know what, we'll just leave it as default in 720p. And in most situations, the game was definitely playable with around 48 to 60 FPS on average, but this could drop down from anywhere to 20 to 30 FPS when there was lots of foliage on screen, so you might want to tweak some of those settings down a little bit if you are using a Radeon X300. I don't know anyone why would be, or they'd be playing this game, but if you are, there's some good advice for you. Hitman Blood Money did require me to use low settings in 480p to actually achieve a playable frame rate, as the difference between medium and low in this game seems to be extraordinarily intensive, but it did mean we saw 97 FPS on average throughout the first level of the game. In fact, even at its worst, it'd be very rare you'd see anything under 50 FPS. So Hitman Blood Money works absolutely fine. I don't have much experience playing this game, I mostly played Codename 47 back when I had it, but I don't have that on hand to install at the moment, so Blood Money, well, it's going to run. The original Just Cause did prove rather intensive on the card, as even with low settings in 800x600, which is the lowest resolution the game will natively drop down to, we saw just under 30 FPS on average, which is still once again very similar to that of the original Xbox. It still does look really rather good with these settings and can actually be a rather painful game to keep stable in places, but the X300 had performance problems but no stability problems, so if you can call this frame rate playable, maybe it's not the worst option for a retro card to play it through on. One of the games I used to play a lot on a Mobility Radeon laptop was actually Mount & Blade Warband, which runs best with medium settings with DirectX 7 enabled in 720p, so you get to enjoy a high definition resolution. It's not the prettiest game by any means, but it can look alright in places, and we did actually get to keep a few nice graphical settings turned on. We saw 46 FPS on average with 1% lows of 33 FPS, which is by no means unplayable. So Mount & Blade Warband is definitely playable, you're just going to want to stick away from running DirectX 9 on here, when DirectX 7 not only looks better on this graphics card, but runs better too. When running the original PC release of Oddworld Munch's Odyssey, we're able to keep the game with the default settings, which is the same it uses on the original Xbox, something I've said a lot today, and you would see 42 FPS on average. You did get a nice bump over the console versions though, as you're now able to see the game running in 720p HD at a slightly higher frame rate. It was liable to go down from this in places when you were streaming in lots of data, such as the initial flyover sequence, but generally, Oddworld games, up until this point, they're going to run absolutely fine on the X300. Civilization 4, you're probably thinking, wow, with those frame rates, why didn't you change the settings down to medium or something like that? And the reality is, For some reason the game would just crash whenever I tried to change the graphics settings, so I just ran with it at this point. High settings in 1024x768 offered us what I would consider to be a playable frame rate in this game. I mostly used to use mine to play Civilization 3 because it was dirt cheap on Steam back in the day. It was like 79 pence, but Civilization 4 does look a lot better and will run at just under 30 FPS, which is by no means a problem. So Civ 4 will run and does look pretty good in these settings with a Radeon X300 SE. Here's a fun one for you though. RimWorld has just announced that it's going to be having the 1.6 update and some new DLC, so I've been testing out the 1.6 Unstable branch. And it turns out, inadvertently, as much as they managed to increase performance in the late game for most people that are actually playing this, they've somehow fixed a bug that has plagued old ATI cards for years. So for some reason now, you can actually enjoy RimWorld on a Radeon X300 with actually a rather competent frame rate. Previous to this, it used to have problems where everything would load in pink and nothing would work quite properly, and this has been a problem from alpha through to even version 1.5, so miraculously, probably by accident, Ludion, the developers of RimWorld, have managed to make this game playable on ATI's Radeon X series, which is absolutely extraordinary. This was entirely done by accident. I really doubt they've gone out of their way to patch this specifically for this set of graphics cards, but the reality is that it now works absolutely fine here. One issue is though Terraria is now struggling in 2025. I know the game has certainly had its fair share of updates, and those have mostly been all good updates, but we're now seeing that even in 1024x768 using performance options, we are only going to be seeing around 26 FPS, and that's in the overworld where things are, if anything, at their most light. So Terraria is playable, but you are going to probably be having a harder time in the late game when there's lots of particle effects and things like that going on. So it is mostly playable up to a point, but it is definitely struggling in more recent years. Splinter Cell Chaos Theory does look remarkably good, even with low settings utilising Shader Model 1.1, and we were also using a 480p resolution. Even then, the game does look really rather good, and we saw just under 60 FPS on average. Now, the larger, more open areas, which frankly are quite rare in this game, could bring you down to just over 30 FPS, so still a playable frame rate, but Splinter Cell Chaos Theory runs and looks great on what is a low-end display adapter from the era of its release. Now you've got to remember, the X300, as we've already said, was a low-end card, but here we have it running a game that was rather intensive from a similar time that the card launched, with actually okay settings. Now we did have to use low textures as that was simply too much for the card, but everything else was either set to medium or high, meaning the game looked absolutely fantastic in 800x600 and could even cross over 60 FPS when not much was going on. Given this is very much the the Crysis of its own era, it's absolutely astonishing that the X300 is even able to manage it this well, and it goes to show that as a DirectX 9 entry-level card, it really is rather capable of delivering some really solid performance in DirectX 9 titles. When you do start straying into the world of next generation and think that Xbox 360 era though, things do get a little bit more of a struggle, as you're no longer on parity like you are with the PS2 and the original Xbox. In fact, you will be playing the games, but you'll be playing them with low settings in 640x480, which is not the worst this game can look. Its settings can go much lower than this. So it actually does look okay and it plays alright, and when you're actually inside a dungeon, you'll be seeing over double the frame rate you're seeing here, usually hovering around 50 to 70 FPS. But out in the overworld and actually doing anything remotely intensive, you'll be seeing just north of 30 FPS. But I think that is still relatively impressive, given that I wasn't expecting the game to even launch properly on this card, yet alone work as well as it is. Now, we already know from last week's video that Star Wars Battlefront will run on this card, so to make things a little bit more intensive than they already were, I decided to load up one of the more intensive maps, which has a lot more foliage going on and can generally prove a bit more taxing, especially on these lower end cards. And with a mixture of low and medium settings in 720p, we were seeing just under 30 FPS on average, which was responsive enough to play the game, and you could of course lower a few things down to nudge it just north of 30 FPS, but I'd still consider Star Wars Battlefront playable like this. Given the era this card released in, one of the big selling points was being able to show that you could run Half-Life 2 on even your cheapest graphics card available. But Half-Life 2 we know is going to run, so I managed to get Black Mesa running, and Black Mesa running with the Zen levels, which are some of the most intensive levels that can even bring new graphics cards down to their knees, with the Gmod engine. So I loaded up the game through Gary's mod, so it was on an older version of Source Engine, and I could disable a few more effects that would stop the card from crashing. And it looks absolutely brilliant even with low settings. We only saw around 25 FPS on average, which was never going to be playable on this graphics card, but the fact the X300 is getting this close to playable, in fact, I probably would have had a good go at trying to play through this at these frame rates back in the day. You know, it's kind of impressive that it's able to even manage to run the game at all. But finally, can it run Crysis? Well, it took me quite a while to even get it to launch. Who would have thought that Crysis does not like running on the Radeon X series? I mean, we've had it running on an X800 before and that was okay, but really the X300 is pushing what Crysis should be even able to launch on. But still, with enough tweaking, we got into game and used low settings in 480p to achieve 9 FPS on average. Now, the frame times were rather good as they were really consistent, but that doesn't mean the Crysis is playable. I mean, I actually got through a decent chunk of the game playing it like this. I have no idea why I carried on playing it like this, it's almost headache-inducing, but you can get away with a little bit of Crysis, it's just going to be like a PowerPoint, that's really all there is to it. Overall in the benchmarks then, performance was really rather stellar. I mean, the notable highlights include being able to run any game from its era really quite well with higher settings, and a good quality output. I mean, we are sort of cheating there as we are using a digital signal, but still, having a digital signal output on a card from 2004 that can deliver this type of performance, and you can grab them really quite cheap with a nice looking cooler on, that's quite impressive and quite nice to see. RimWorld actually being able to now run on the card was one of the ones that caught me out because I've got far too much footage of me actually playing the game on the card, and given that along with Don't Starve it makes up a couple of the most played daily games on Steam, at least in the top 100, I mean they're simpler titles but they are now running on what is 21-year-old hardware. One of my favourite takeaways from the benchmarks though was Black Mesa actually looking really good. I mean the Zen performance can even be a struggle on new graphics cards because at higher settings this can be even more taxing than it is on this graphics card, but loading it up with the Gmod engine and seeing it just run on the card, something that never would have been factored in by the developers or never factored in by ATI themselves that this would even come to exist, well, it ran, and I think that was quite impressive. So for a low-end GPU from its era, specifically a cut-down version, I would say that was really remarkably solid performance, because I think as a retro graphics card, it's quite cool. The thing is, though, you can get better graphics card than this, for cheaper than this, and that's why the X300 is in a weird spot in the market, where we are looking at it of its merits of it's doing well for a 20-plus-year-old card, but could you do better than this if you were buying something else? Well, probably anything newer on PCIe would work, but it runs things well and it's got good compatibility, so we can give it that. But there are going to be some people saying, the X300 can perform even better than this. I don't know who's actually saying this, but there's guaranteed to be at least one person here saying testing on Windows 11 is pointless for this graphics card. Well, unfortunately, it is 2025, so when we're testing these graphics cards, it's nice to see how they're holding up on a modern operating system. But for those two of you that are complaining about the performance difference between Windows 11 and Windows Vista that this was designed for, here are the performance differences. Fable the Lost Chapters, virtually no change. Crysis performed slightly better on Windows Vista, but not enough to make it playable, and the same goes for Black Mesa, where it performed ever so slightly. We're talking 1 or 2 FPS better. Banished, on the other hand, a modern indie game, actually performed much better on Windows 11. I mean, it's still playable on both systems, but Windows 11 did have quite a lead here. Splinter Cell, on the other hand, ran better on Vista, and Oblivion ran better on Windows 11. So that's the full comparison I did. Really, there is not much gaming difference between Windows 11 and Windows Vista on these low-end cards, provided they actually launch on Windows 11. Windows Vista does offer more compatibility, and you'll probably get the Catalyst side of things to actually open on here, but you can bring up a full comparison here. There is very little difference in the actual averages or 1% lows when comparing against Windows 11 or Vista, so take of this what you will, and I hope that satisfies people saying that it's wrong to test these graphics cards on modern Windows, because to me, personally, I just like seeing and admiring that these cards still work in the world of 2025, where people are going to be running Windows 11. But hang on a second, we've been talking about the Radeon X300, and yes, I have hijacked this video on the MSI cooler to talk about the praises of the X300 and how much I enjoyed using it for however long I had the card. But really, this video has always been about that MSI cooler. And the truth is, it runs hot. It is not a good heatsink at all. This card has had fresh thermal paste, and it's often at 60 degrees when just sitting at the desktop. This was slightly lower in Windows Vista, but only by 1 or 2 degrees. When gaming, it would readily hit 80 degrees, and when running 3D Mark, which actually stresses this card to its maximum, it could go even higher than this. So it really does go to show that MSI heatsink really isn't up to snuff, because, you know, it's just... When cards were beginning to become more demanding for power on the lower end, it makes sense that MSI phased this thing out, because this was the last time we saw this cooler was on this X300 SE, and it's by no means a power-hungry card, but it is struggling to keep it cool even at the desktop. I mean, yes, maybe a fan would help, but at the end of the day, it's a graphics card intended to be used as a display adapter, and it's also low profile, so you can see this stuck in one of those little Dell Optiplex GX things that you used to see in offices and, you know, whenever. The point is, the graphics card is rather competent, but the cooler isn't. It'll keep it cool enough to run, and it's not going to overheat, but it definitely is, what's the way of explaining it? It definitely is fashion over form here. It's a lovely looking cooler, but it's not going to keep your graphics card cool at all. So there we have it, the weird MSI cooler graphics card heatsink thing. And I have never set out before to make a history video on a heatsink of all things, but we've learned a couple of things today. One, this heatsink looks cool and came on a lot of rather questionable cards, and people love this thing because the amount of likes that I got for just posting a picture of this thing on Twitter and YouTube shows that people really do love the funky MSI retro heatsink. And I suppose if we can get hold of the Nvidia GeForce 6200 version, maybe that could be fun to look at. But, you know, how would I sum up this card? Well, the X300 performance was interesting to see, and there was definitely a large motivator for me to make this video because I've been meaning to do a revisit on that card for a while. But if you do want a retro Radeon, the X300 is not a bad idea. Just probably get one that's not got this cooler on it. If you do want one with this cooler because you're going for the retro appeal, definitely have some good airflow, because we had airflow on the card and it ran hot. So I don't really know much else to say about that. The only cool thing about it other than that is they did release it into the PCIe era with this card and the GeForce 6200, so that's kind of cool. Anyway, I hope you've all enjoyed this very strange video. I don't even know how to describe this style of video. I don't even have a playlist for cooler stories, so it'll probably go in the graphics cards playlist. But anyway, thank you all very much for watching, and good night.